Let me go ahead and just outline three main ideas in regard to giving an introduction. The first thing I want to talk about is how the Red Book was made. And I am serious about this invitation. I want you all to think about the possibility of making one of these yourself. And so I just want to give you an outline of how the Red Book came to be put together. In 1913, Jung subjected himself to what he called a series of active imagination experiments. And he used a series of notebooks to record these active imaginations. They were bound in leather and they were black. And so now we refer to them as the black books. Now I'll outline shortly what I mean by active imagination. But he simply filled these books up, and then he would get secretarial help in creating clean drafts of what was in the black book. And you know, this harkens back to another age where he would often have his clients go through these sections of the black book. He hired them as secretarial help to create clean copies, and then he would circulate some of these copies so that other people could read and comment. So, you know, one of the things I want you to know is that the Red Book was a personal project, but it was not secret. It was not something he was doing down in his basement. We're laughing at the dog here doing some antics. So when he would get these copies, he would also have colleagues comment, make suggestions, and then eventually he purchased a red folio from a bookstore in Zurich. It was bound in red leather, and it was about as large as this. This is a little bit bigger than, you know, the actual size of the Red Book, but he had it where he had 600 pages. He could open up the binding, take a page out, and then he started transcribing material in the black books. But he used very fine calligraphy. The material in that Red Book would get transcribed, and he would use very fine calligraphy. He would also use a practice called drop caps. And I'm going to show you a picture of a drop cap here pretty soon. But in medieval folios, those would be when the first letter of the beginning of a paragraph has a very beautiful design that's included into it. So after he put a series of these sections together, he made copies of them. And I don't know how you would make a copy of that in the 1920s. I'm assuming that a photographer would just take photographs of it. But he would distribute that amongst colleagues and friends. And they would comment. There's all sorts of letters that have been written back and forth, and people reading the material and commenting to you. So again, I just want to dispel that myth that, you know, the Red Book was something that happened entirely in secret without anybody else, you know, participating in it. Well, he did this for about 16 years. So the black books took him probably about 3 years to fill those notebooks up with material. But folks, it was a 16-year process of him taking those pieces of writing, putting it in calligraphy, creating these beautiful paintings, all sorts of flourishes. Now, just for the record, he stopped doing this in about 1929 or 1930. And that's where he got very interested in alchemy. And I think this would be the subject of a wonderful talk. You know, the moment Jung put his Red Book down and then started working in alchemy. But the fact is that he probably only transcribed about a third of the content in the black books. And so technically it was a project that was unfinished. But look, let's face it, after 16 years, I think he was done with it. And I think it accomplished what he had set out to accomplish. And that was essentially practicing Jungian methods on himself. Okay? All right, so that's part one of my introduction. Any questions or comments? Christine's hand is up.
I'm just wondering.
Okay, looks like we have some other folks joining us. And there's a question on the floor that I'm going to repeat for you folks out in Zoom.
Come on in.
Okay, so folks out in Zoom, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 10 people here present in the room at St. Francis. We have a couple of pilgrims that lost their way. Apparently, they went to a different church. But that's okay. It's all the same spirit. So there's a question on the floor. Christine, who is present with us, asked, where does the Red Book fit into Jung's, how did you describe this? His psychological break, you had mentioned, or his psychosis, some people have described it as. Well, the Red Book, the Black Book experiment started in 1913. Let me double check that. Yeah, 1913. That was the very moment when he made his split with Freud. And that is what created that upheaval for him and that crisis in his life. He was completely untethered. And the section that we're going to read from today addresses that. I do want to say something about, in terms of his mental state. Many people have argued Jung had a psychotic break, and that's what happened to him, and that's what, created the Red Book. But, logs show that he was seeing an average of 5 clients a day. He was making presentations. He was volunteering in the Swiss Army. He was having dinner engagements with friends and family. And so I don't think we would assess him as being psychotic.
He's doing that.
Right. Maybe he could have slowed down. Okay, any other questions or comments before we talk a little bit about active imagination? Okay. So let's talk about the active imagination experiments that Jung was filling those black books with. I have to say 2 things that are some assumptions that Jung had. The first assumption was that we have an unconscious, and that it is a resource that we can cooperate with and benefit from. But it is also something that can do us harm if we are not in alignment with unconscious. So if you look at a book like Man and His Symbols, well, Jung only wrote 1 chapter, not 4, but he claimed that there were 3 access points to the unconscious. And one was the association method, that he essentially learned from Freud, and I think polished and perfected, later called amplification. But that's one entry point, is association. The second entry point was working with night dreams in regard to interacting with the unconscious and receiving useful information. The third category includes visions, daydreams, fantasy. Okay, so those are essentially the 3 access. Folks, in my reading this year about the Red Book, I was shocked to discover that Jung claimed vision, daydreams, and fantasies are much more useful material to help us along the way, even above dreams. I mean, does that surprise you all?
Yeah, it does.
Well, Jung said that he discovered the material that comes from visions, daydreams, and fantasy can be more useful than the material that comes from night dreams.
I have a question. What exactly did he mean by visions?
Well, that's a good question, and it's hard to answer. But how about this? Intrusions of your imagination.
Okay.
Absolute intrusion where, he had a number of these experiences himself. I want to amplify what Christine said for you all if you didn't hear it at home. She said, how ironic that what Jung viewed as the most important and useful access points to the unconscious, we now pathologize. And we even use a phrase now in mental health. We say with psychotic features. Like, for example, you can be depressed, you can be diagnosed with depression and have psychotic features, which means you're having vision, you're having intrusive daydreams or fantasies that could be disturbing to you. Let me explain why he thought it was, I don't know the best word to use, more useful. He claimed that when we are asleep, we are completely relaxed and our nervous system is not being overly activated by our complexes. But if we are in a hypnagogic state, or what we would call the alpha state of consciousness now, where we are definitely aware, but we are drifting out into an imaginal realm, or we are letting information emerge from the unconscious, or we're hearing that little jabbering, if you meditate at all, that is compensatory the same way dreams are, but we're charged by our complexes, so the compensation is going to be more fruitful if we work with it. Well, folks, among other things, the Red Book is really a showcase of these kinds of applied active imagination experiments. It's a showcase of working with the access points of the unconscious in creative ways. I mean, that's really, I think, the easiest way to understand the large project of the Red Book. Let me tell you what Jung said about active imagination. Now, I'm not going to try to, summarize all of what Jung believed about active imagination, but I want to quote one of his clients. I mean, we have to be careful about this. This would be called third hand. Jung said something to one of his clients, and then his client wrote this down and is, given it to the world now. But in 1926, there was a woman named Christiana Morgan, and she had been a patient of Jung's, and Jung was encouraging her to practice active imagination experiments and exercises herself. And so this is what he said. I'm just going to read this as a quote. Now, when you see these images, it's talking about you're in a relaxed state, you're in the alpha mode of consciousness. Now, when you see these images, you want to hold them and see where they take you, how they change. And you want to get into the picture yourself to become one of the actors. When I first began to do this, I saw landscapes. Then I learned how to put myself into the landscape. And the figures would talk to me, and I would answer them. Well, that's why the Red Book is so hard to understand, folks. And he is right.
Charles,
Yes.
could you give that quotation, please? Which book or?
This I got from the introduction to the Red Book from Sanu Shamdasani. It's right in the introduction of the Red Book. And it's from a series of letters that patient had written and that are archived.
After this book club, would you be willing to email participants with that quote or any other quotes, and then also the website addresses where they can view images, please?
Yes, I would be willing to do that. Let me make a note of making references.
Thank you.
So this is the last thing I'll say before we start to read. Are we running until what time?
11.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So this is what you can expect when you read the Red Book. It's challenging. There are 3 different stylistic registers or voices when you read through the material that you wrote. And I hope you can see how those voices are what's called stylistic registers relate to those active imagination exercises. Okay, sometimes we have a voice that is a faithful reporter. It's the Carl Jung that we all know and love. And he's saying, hey, I had a dream last night, and this is exactly what the dream was. I'm going to just, write it out the way that it happened. And then there will be a conceptual explication of that dream. There will be comments, there will be interpretation, there will be rumination from that dream. Okay, that's a second kind of stylistic register. But there's a third one. And it's what some people have called the oracular voice or the prophetic voice. And this is when he's having one of these conversations with his soul. He's having a conversation with some prophet he is, found in a landscape, and they're having a dialogue back and forth. So it makes it very, it can make it very confusing when we read this. We always have to ask ourselves, hold on now, which Jung is this? Is this the guy that we know in conscious and waking life? Is this one of his own dream images speaking to us and being personified? So keep that in mind as you're reading the section.